Maya Chen sat frozen at her grandmother's mahogany dining table, watching her older sister Sophia lean across the flickering candlelight to whisper something into her boyfriend Derek's ear. The sound of her family's laughter echoed around the room as someone told another story about childhood Christmas mornings, but Maya couldn't focus on anything except the way Derek's face had flushed when Sophia touched his arm. What happened next would shatter everything Maya thought she knew about her family, her relationship, and herself. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like every other Christmas at the Chen family estate in Westchester County. Maya had arrived early to help her grandmother prepare the traditional feast, rolling dumplings in the warm kitchen while snow dusted the windows of the sprawling colonial home that had housed 4 generations of their family. At 25, Maya was the quiet one, the steady one, the daughter who never caused drama or demanded attention. She worked as a veterinary technician at a small animal clinic, lived in a modest apartment in the city, and had been dating Derek Morrison for 8 months. Derek was everything her family approved of. He was a marketing executive at a prestigious firm, drove a sleek BMW, and had the kind of confident smile that made parents trust him instantly. When Maya had brought him to last year's Christmas dinner, her grandmother had pulled her aside afterward to whisper that she'd finally found someone worthy of the Chen family legacy. Her parents had nodded approvingly throughout the evening, asking Derek about his career prospects and investment portfolio with the kind of genuine interest they rarely showed in Maya's work with animals. Sophia, meanwhile, had spent the last 3 years bouncing between cities, careers, and relationships. At 28, she was the artistic one, the free spirit who painted abstract canvases in her loft in Brooklyn when she wasn't traveling through Europe or Asia documenting her adventures on social media. She had arrived that morning in a whirlwind of designer luggage and exotic stories, her raven black hair styled in beachy waves that somehow looked effortless despite clearly requiring professional attention. She wore a cream-colored cashmere dress that hugged her petite frame perfectly, paired with vintage jewelry that looked both expensive and bohemian. The contrast between the sisters had always been stark. Where Sophia was petite and delicate, Maya was taller with broader shoulders and the kind of practical beauty that came from spending her days caring for animals rather than posing for photographs. Where Sophia commanded attention the moment she entered a room, Maya preferred to observe from the sidelines, offering quiet support and thoughtful insights when asked. Their parents, Dr. James Chen and his wife Linda, had built a successful medical practice together, specializing in pediatric cardiology. They lived in a world of hospital galas and medical conferences where success was measured in publications and patient outcomes. They had always struggled to understand Maya's choice to work with animals rather than pursuing medicine or another prestigious career. When she'd graduated from college with a degree in biology, they'd assumed she would continue to veterinary school. When she'd chosen instead to work as a technician, they'd masked their disappointment behind polite support. Sophia, however, could do no wrong. Her art might not generate steady income, but it was creative and sophisticated. Her travels were cultural enrichment. Her ever-changing career path was evidence of her diverse talents and refusal to be constrained by conventional expectations. When she'd spent 6 months in Tuscany learning traditional fresco techniques, their parents had bragged to their friends about their daughter's artistic residency. When Maya had completed her certification in animal behavior therapy, they'd mentioned it briefly before changing the subject. The family dynamics had been established early and reinforced over decades. Sophia was the star, the one whose accomplishments were celebrated and whose struggles were met with immediate support. Maya was the responsible one, the one who could be counted on to handle whatever needed handling without complaint or drama. It was a role she'd accepted, even embraced, until recently. The shift had begun 6 months earlier when Maya had started dating Derek. For the first time in her adult life, she'd brought someone home who impressed her parents. Derek was successful, ambitious, and came from the kind of old-money Connecticut family that moved in the same social circles as the Chens. He spoke knowledgeably about wine and art, had opinions about the stock market, and treated Maya with the kind of attentive respect that made her grandmother beam with approval. More importantly, Derek seemed to genuinely see Maya in a way her family never had. He listened when she talked about her work, asking thoughtful questions about animal behavior and veterinary procedures. He brought her coffee at the clinic during her long shifts and didn't mind that their dates sometimes involved hiking trails or visiting botanical gardens rather than trendy restaurants. He made her feel valued for who she was rather than who she might become if she tried harder to fit the family mold. As Christmas morning progressed, Maya found herself relaxing into the familiar rhythms of family celebration. Her grandmother directed the preparation of the elaborate feast with the precision of a military general, sending Maya and her cousins on various missions to set tables, arrange flowers, and taste test different dishes. Derek had offered to help and been assigned the crucial task of keeping the children entertained while the adults finished cooking. Maya watched from the kitchen window as he built a snowman with her 8-year-old cousin Tommy, his expensive wool coat getting progressively more disheveled as he threw himself into the project with genuine enthusiasm. It was one of the things she loved about him, his ability to adapt to any situation and find ways to connect with people. He'd won over her entire extended family within an hour of arriving, discussing basketball with her Uncle Mike, admiring her Aunt Carol's garden plans, and listening with apparent fascination as her grandfather explained his collection of vintage chess sets. When Sophia had arrived at noon in a flurry of apologies and air kisses, Maya had felt the familiar shift in the room's energy. Conversations paused as heads turned toward the door. Her grandmother immediately began fussing over Sophia's coat and asking about her flight from the West Coast, where she'd been staying with friends in San Francisco. Her parents dropped everything to gather around and hear about her latest artistic project, a series of installations inspired by the changing seasons that would debut at a gallery in Soho the following spring. Derek had been building a snow fort with the children when Sophia emerged from the house, having changed into something more suitable for outdoor activities. Maya had watched through the window as her sister approached the group, her laugh carrying across the yard as she joined in the snowball fight that spontaneously erupted. Derek had seemed surprised but pleased by her participation, and Maya had felt a small flutter of pride that her boyfriend was getting along so well with her family. The afternoon had proceeded smoothly through the elaborate Christmas feast. Her grandmother's dining room had been transformed into something from a magazine spread, with antique china, crystal glasses that caught the light from the chandelier, and centerpieces of winter greenery and white roses. The extended family had filled every seat around the massive table, with conversations flowing in multiple languages as different generations shared stories and caught up on the year's events. Maya had been seated between Derek and her cousin Sarah, directly across from Sophia, who held court at the center of the table with stories from her travels. She described morning markets in Barcelona, art studios in Berlin, and sunrise yoga sessions on beaches in Thailand with the kind of vivid detail that made everyone feel they were experiencing the adventures alongside her. Derek had listened with obvious interest, asking questions about the places Sophia had visited and the artists she'd met. There had been nothing unusual about the attention Derek paid to Sophia's stories. Maya's boyfriend was naturally curious about other people's experiences, and Sophia was an engaging storyteller. When Sophia had mentioned her struggles to find adequate studio space in Brooklyn, Derek had offered suggestions about neighborhoods she might explore and connections he might be able to make through his work. When she'd talked about the challenges of shipping artwork internationally, he'd shared insights from his marketing background about logistics and distribution. Maya had felt grateful that Derek was making such an effort to connect with her family. Too many of her previous relationships had withered under the pressure of family gatherings, with boyfriends either intimidated by her parents' success or put off by the complex dynamics between the sisters. Derek seemed genuinely comfortable in the environment, contributing to conversations without trying to dominate them and showing interest in everyone around the table. The first hint that something was amiss had come during dessert, when her grandmother brought out the traditional Christmas pudding alongside an assortment of pastries from the family's favorite bakery in the city. Sophia had mentioned that she was trying to avoid sugar as part of a new wellness routine, and Derek had immediately offered to share his portion of fruit instead of dessert. It was a small gesture, but Maya had noticed the way Sophia's face had lit up with surprised gratitude, and the way Derek had seemed pleased to be helpful. When the formal dinner had ended and the family had moved to the living room for the traditional gift exchange, Maya had begun to notice other small interactions. Derek had offered to help Sophia carry her presents, commenting on the beautiful wrapping paper she'd chosen. When Sophia had struggled to untie a particularly stubborn ribbon, Derek leaned across to assist, their heads bent close together over the package. When Sophia had opened a gift of art supplies from their grandmother, Derek examined the brushes with genuine interest, asking knowledgeable questions about their construction and intended use. None of it had seemed inappropriate at the time. Derek was naturally helpful and curious, qualities Maya appreciated about him. Sophia was charming and grateful for attention, qualities that had endeared her to people throughout her life. But as the afternoon had progressed, Maya had begun to feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a sense that conversations were happening in subtext that she wasn't quite catching. The family had settled into their traditional post-dinner activities. The older generation had claimed the comfortable chairs near the fireplace for their annual discussion of family business and catching up on relatives who couldn't attend. The children had disappeared to the game room in the basement with their new toys. The adults of Maya's generation had gathered around the piano, where her cousin David was playing a mixture of Christmas carols and jazz standards, while others sang along or continued conversations in small groups. Maya had been helping her aunt clean up in the kitchen when she'd glanced through the doorway and seen Derek and Sophia sitting together on the window seat overlooking the garden. They were deep in conversation, their voices too low to hear over the music and general chatter, but their body language suggested an intimacy that made Maya pause in her dish drying. Sophia was leaning forward with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for discussing art or travel, while Derek was gesturing animatedly in a way Maya recognized as his enthusiasm for a new idea or interesting person. She had told herself she was being paranoid. Derek was a social person who enjoyed meeting new people and learning about their experiences. Sophia was fascinating to talk to, with her artistic background and international adventures. There was nothing unusual about them finding common ground for conversation. Maya had returned to her cleaning duties, pushing down the small voice in her head that suggested something about the interaction felt different from casual family socializing. The evening had continued with more music, board games, and the kind of relaxed socializing that made Christmas at the Chen house feel magical. Maya had found herself watching Derek and Sophia more carefully, noting the way they seemed to seek each other out for conversation, and the way their laughter seemed to sync up across the room. When Sophia had mentioned feeling cold, Derek had immediately offered his sweater, even though Maya was sitting right next to her and could have provided her own jacket. As the extended family had begun to leave and the house had grown quieter, Maya had hoped the strange tension she'd been sensing would dissipate. Instead, it had seemed to intensify as the remaining group had gathered around the fireplace for the traditional end-of-evening storytelling session. Her grandmother had shared memories of Christmas celebrations from her childhood in Taiwan, while her parents had talked about their early years of marriage and the traditions they'd tried to maintain as they'd built their life in America. Derek had been invited to share his family's Christmas traditions, and he'd talked about elaborate dinners at his grandparents' estate in Greenwich, complete with formal place settings and multiple courses prepared by professional caterers. His stories had painted a picture of old-money elegance that clearly impressed Maya's parents, who had nodded approvingly at charity galas and yacht club parties. Sophia had shared stories from her recent travels, describing Christmas markets in Prague and New Year celebrations on beaches in Australia, where she'd connected with other artists and writers. Her tales had been filled with the kind of spontaneous adventures and bohemian romance that made Maya's own life feel mundane by comparison. Even Derek had seemed captivated by Sophia's descriptions of midnight painting sessions in abandoned buildings and impromptu collaborations with street musicians. As the evening had wound down and people had begun making noises about leaving, Maya had felt increasingly unsettled by what she'd observed. The interactions between Derek and Sophia hadn't crossed any obvious lines, but something about their dynamic had felt different from typical family socializing. There had been an undercurrent of attraction, a sense of two people discovering unexpected compatibility and being intrigued by the possibilities. When Derek had offered to help Sophia load her luggage into her car for her drive back to the city, Maya had watched from the window as they'd spent nearly 20 minutes talking beside her sister's vintage convertible. Their conversation had appeared intense and intimate, with Sophia gesturing expressively while Derek listened with the kind of focused attention he'd once reserved exclusively for Maya. The drive home to Maya's apartment had been unusually quiet. Derek had seemed lost in thought, responding to Maya's attempts at conversation with distracted murmurs and half-hearted contributions.
When she'd asked if he'd enjoyed meeting her extended family, he'd been enthusiastic but vague, praising the warmth of the gathering and the quality of the food without mentioning specific people or conversations. Maya had told herself she was reading too much into a perfectly innocent family gathering. Derek was naturally social and curious about people. Sophia was charming and interesting to talk to. There was nothing unusual about them connecting during a long day of family socializing. But as she'd lain awake that night, replaying the day's events in her mind, she'd been unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The days following Christmas had confirmed her suspicions. Derek had become distant and distracted, checking his phone more frequently and seeming less engaged in their conversations. When Maya suggested they spend New Year's Eve together, he'd claimed work obligations that required him to attend a company party where partners weren't invited. When she'd offered to cook dinner at her apartment, he'd suggested they go out instead, choosing restaurants where intimate conversation was difficult over the noise and crowds. Maya had told herself she was reading too much into a perfectly innocent family gathering. Derek was naturally social and curious about people. Sophia was charming and interesting to talk to. There was nothing unusual about them connecting during a long day of family socializing. But as she'd lain awake that night, replaying the day's events in her mind, she'd been unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The days following Christmas had confirmed her suspicions. Derek had become distant and distracted, checking his phone more frequently and seeming less engaged in their conversations. When Maya suggested they spend New Year's Eve together, he'd claimed work obligations that required him to attend a company party where partners weren't invited. When she'd offered to cook dinner at her apartment, he'd suggested they go out instead, choosing restaurants where intimate conversation was difficult over the noise and crowds.
Most tellingly, Derek had begun mentioning Sophia in casual conversation, referring to things she'd said during Christmas dinner or asking Maya about her sister's art and travel experiences. He'd claimed to be curious about the creative process and interested in learning more about different career paths, but Maya had sensed something deeper in his questions. The revelation had come 2 weeks after Christmas, when Maya had been walking through Soho after visiting a friend and had spotted Derek emerging from the gallery where Sophia's installation was being prepared for display. He'd been alone, carrying a catalog and looking thoughtful in a way that suggested he'd spent considerable time studying the artwork. When Maya had called his name, he'd looked startled and guilty, claiming he'd been in the neighborhood for a client meeting and had decided to stop by out of curiosity. The explanation had been plausible but unsatisfying. Derek's client meetings typically took place in midtown office buildings, not in trendy art galleries downtown. His interest in contemporary art had been minimal throughout their relationship, extending only to the occasional museum visit when Maya had specifically requested it. The timing of his gallery visit, during work hours on a weekday when Sophia would likely be present to oversee the installation, had seemed suspiciously convenient. Maya had begun paying closer attention to Derek's behavior, noting the way he'd light up when she mentioned Sophia's name and the frequency with which he'd steer conversations toward topics related to art and travel. When she'd mentioned that Sophia was struggling to find affordable studio space, Derek had immediately offered suggestions and connections with an enthusiasm he'd never shown for Maya's professional challenges. When Sophia had posted photos of her artwork on social media, Derek had been among the first to comment with thoughtful observations and questions. The situation had come to a head 3 weeks after Christmas, when Maya had discovered Derek's LinkedIn profile showing recent connections with several people in Sophia's Art World network. A casual search had revealed that he'd been actively networking within the contemporary art scene, attending gallery openings and industry events that he'd never mentioned to Maya. His social media activity had shown a sudden interest in art criticism and cultural commentary that seemed to align perfectly with Sophia's areas of expertise. When Maya had confronted Derek about his newfound interest in the art world, he'd been defensive and evasive, claiming he was exploring new hobbies and expanding his cultural horizons. He'd accused Maya of being paranoid and controlling, suggesting that her suspicions were evidence of deeper trust issues in their relationship. The conversation had escalated into their first serious argument, ending with Derek storming out of Maya's apartment and not returning her calls for 3 days. During those 3 days of silence, Maya had done what she'd always done when faced with family drama. She'd focused on her work and tried to push her personal problems to the back of her mind.
She'd thrown herself into caring for the animals at the clinic, staying late to provide extra attention to the more difficult cases, and volunteering for emergency calls that other technicians preferred to avoid. The work had been therapeutic, reminding her of her competence and value in at least one area of her life. But even the distraction of work hadn't been enough to silence the growing certainty that her relationship with Derek was fundamentally compromised. Whether or not anything physical had happened between Derek and Sophia, the emotional connection between them had been unmistakable. Derek's attention and affection had shifted away from Maya in ways that felt permanent and irreversible. The man who had once listened with genuine interest to her stories about difficult animal cases now seemed impatient with her concerns and distracted during their conversations. Maya had been forced to confront the possibility that Derek's initial attraction to her had been based more on her connection to her impressive family than on genuine compatibility. Her parents' success and social standing had provided him with access to networks and opportunities that aligned with his own ambitions. Sophia's artistic connections and bohemian lifestyle offered him something even more appealing: access to a world of creativity and cultural sophistication that his corporate background had never provided. The realization had been devastating but clarifying. Maya had spent months believing that Derek valued her for who she was, only to discover that his interest had been primarily transactional. Her worth to him had been measured by what she could provide rather than who she was as a person. The relationship she'd thought was built on mutual respect and genuine affection had been revealed as something much more superficial and conditional. As Maya had prepared for the family's New Year's Day gathering, she'd been dreading the inevitable encounter between Derek and Sophia. The celebration was smaller than Christmas, typically limited to immediate family and very close friends, but both Derek and Sophia were expected to attend. Maya had considered making excuses to avoid the gathering entirely, but her sense of family obligation had prevented her from following through on the impulse. The morning of New Year's Day had dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp winter light that made everything look sharp and defined. Maya had dressed carefully in a navy blue sweater and dark jeans, choosing clothes that made her feel confident and put together without appearing to try too hard. She'd arrived at her grandmother's house early, hoping to have some time to prepare mentally for what she suspected would be a difficult day. Her grandmother had immediately put her to work in the kitchen, where the familiar tasks of chopping vegetables and stirring sauces had provided a welcome distraction from her anxiety about the approaching confrontation. They'd worked together in companionable silence, with Maya grateful for her grandmother's intuitive understanding that she needed time to process whatever was troubling her without being forced to explain. Derek arrived precisely on time, carrying a bottle of expensive champagne and wearing the kind of confident smile that had once made Maya's heart race. He'd greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and asked about her week with the kind of polite interest that suggested he was going through the motions of being a good boyfriend without feeling genuine curiosity about her answer. Maya had responded with equal politeness, describing her work at the clinic and asking about his latest marketing campaigns with the kind of surface-level engagement that had become characteristic of their recent interactions. Sophia had arrived 20 minutes later, making her usual dramatic entrance with armloads of gifts and stories about her morning adventures in the city. She'd been to an early yoga class in Central Park, followed by brunch with friends at a trendy restaurant in the East Village, and had stopped by a vintage market to find unique presents for the family. She'd looked radiant in a flowing burgundy dress that complemented her dark hair and highlighted her delicate features. Maya had watched Derek's face transform when Sophia entered the room, his polite smile becoming genuine and his posture straightening with renewed energy. The contrast between his reaction to Maya's arrival and his response to Sophia's entrance was subtle but unmistakable. Where he'd been going through the motions with Maya, he'd come alive in Sophia's presence. The afternoon had proceeded with the kind of forced normalcy that characterizes family gatherings where undercurrents of tension threaten to surface at any moment. Maya had found herself in the strange position of observing her own life from a distance, watching as Derek and Sophia gravitated toward each other with the inevitability of magnetic attraction, while she played the role of the oblivious girlfriend. Their conversations had been carefully appropriate, never crossing obvious boundaries, but maintaining the kind of intimate intensity that excluded everyone else around them. When Sophia had mentioned her upcoming gallery opening, Derek asked detailed questions about the curatorial process and artistic vision behind her work. When Derek had talked about his latest marketing campaign, Sophia listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine interest in the creative challenges of his profession. Maya had felt increasingly like a spectator at her own relationship's dissolution, watching as Derek and Sophia discovered the kind of intellectual and emotional compatibility she thought she'd shared with Derek. Their conversation had flowed with an ease that made Maya realize how much effort her own interactions with Derek had required lately. Where she'd been working to maintain connection and engagement, Derek and Sophia had found effortless synchronization. The moment of truth had come during the traditional champagne toast at midnight, when the family had gathered in the living room to welcome the new year with hopes and resolutions. Maya was standing between Derek and her parents, holding a glass of her grandmother's finest champagne while her grandfather prepared to offer the traditional blessing for the year ahead. As the clock had approached midnight and the family had begun the countdown from 10, Maya had turned toward Derek with the expectation of sharing the traditional New Year's kiss.
Instead, she'd found him looking across the room at Sophia with an expression of such naked longing that it had taken her breath away. In that moment, any remaining doubts about the nature of Derek and Sophia's connection had evaporated completely. The kiss Derek had given Maya at the stroke of midnight had been perfunctory and brief, his attention already shifting back toward Sophia as soon as social obligation had been satisfied. Maya had felt the humiliation of being dismissed in favor of her sister wash over her with familiar intensity, bringing back memories of childhood experiences where Sophia's presence had rendered her invisible. But this time, something had been different. Instead of the usual resignation and self-blame that had characterized Maya's response to being overshadowed by her sister, she'd felt a surge of anger and determination that had surprised her with its intensity. She'd been tired of being treated as a placeholder, tired of accepting whatever attention people were willing to spare after being captivated by Sophia, tired of making herself smaller to accommodate other people's preferences and priorities. As the family had begun to disperse after the toast, Maya had made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Derek and Sophia about what she'd observed, instead of creating drama that would inevitably be blamed on her paranoia and jealousy, she'd chosen a different path entirely. She'd decided to focus on what she'd gained rather than what she'd lost, to pay attention to opportunities that had been developing quietly while she'd been distracted by the drama of her failing relationship. Because while Derek had been falling under Sophia's spell, Maya had been discovering something entirely unexpected about herself and someone else entirely. Someone who had been watching the same family dynamics play out from a different perspective. Someone who had seen Maya's genuine worth when others had been distracted by Sophia's more obvious charms. Someone who had been waiting patiently for Maya to recognize her own value and make the choice to claim it. The revelation that would transform everything had been building quietly for months, hidden beneath the surface of family gatherings and social obligations, waiting for the right moment to emerge and change the entire landscape of Maya's life. And that moment was about to arrive in the most dramatic way possible, during what should have been a simple family dinner, but would instead become the night when all the carefully maintained pretenses finally collapsed and the truth came blazing into the light. The moment Maya had been dreading arrived on a Thursday evening in late January, when her mother called with the kind of forced cheerfulness that always preceded family announcements. Dr. Linda Chen's voice carried through Maya's apartment with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to delivering both good and difficult news to patients and their families. "Maya, sweetheart, we're having a special dinner this Sunday. Your father and I have some wonderful news to share, and we want the whole family together to celebrate." The pause that followed felt weighted with expectation. "Make sure Derek knows he's invited too. Grandmother is making her famous duck, and you know how she loves having a full table." Maya had felt her stomach clench with apprehension. Special family dinners were rarely spontaneous in the Chen household, and the emphasis on including Derek suggested that whatever announcement was coming would somehow involve or affect him. She'd been hoping to postpone any major family gatherings until she could figure out how to handle the deteriorating situation with Derek and Sophia, but her mother's tone brooked no argument. "Of course, Mom, what time should we arrive?" Maya had kept her voice steady despite the anxiety building in her chest. 5 o'clock sharp, and Maya, wear something nice. This is going to be a very special evening. The line had gone dead before Maya could ask any follow-up questions, leaving her staring at her phone with a growing sense of unease. The call to Derek had been even more uncomfortable. He'd answered on the 4th ring, his voice distracted in a way that had become increasingly familiar over the past month.
When Maya had mentioned the family dinner, there had been a long pause before he'd responded with what sounded like genuine confusion. Sunday dinner? Your mom didn't mention anything to me about a special announcement. The comment had struck Maya as odd, since Derek typically only spoke to her mother during family gatherings. Why would her mother have contacted Derek directly about family news? She probably just forgot to mention it when you talked, Maya had replied, fishing for information about when and why Derek might have been in contact with her mother recently. Right, probably. Derek's response had been non-committal, but Maya had detected something else in his tone, something that sounded almost like guilt. The conversation had ended quickly, with Derek claiming he had a conference call starting and promising to pick Maya up at 4:30 on Sunday. As Maya had hung up the phone, she'd been left with the uncomfortable suspicion that Derek knew more about the family dinner than he was letting on. The intervening days had passed slowly, filled with Maya's growing anxiety about what kind of announcement would require Derek's specific presence and her parents' obvious excitement. She'd considered calling Sophia to see if she knew anything about the planned celebration, but something had held her back. The relationship between the sisters had been even more strained since New Year's Day, with their usual perfunctory text exchanges dwindling to complete silence. Maya had thrown herself into her work at the veterinary clinic, staying late to assist with complicated surgeries and volunteering for weekend emergency shifts that kept her mind occupied. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the clinic's senior veterinarian, had noticed Maya's increased hours and dedication with approval, commenting that Maya's skills with difficult animals had improved dramatically over the past month. "You've got a real gift for reading animal behavior," Dr. Hoffman had observed during a particularly challenging case involving an aggressive rescue dog. "Have you ever considered pursuing additional certification in behavioral therapy? I know a program at Cornell that might interest you." The suggestion had sparked something in Maya that she hadn't felt in months. For the first time since Christmas, someone was recognizing her professional potential and encouraging her growth. She'd spent her lunch break researching the Cornell program, discovering that it offered exactly the kind of advanced training she'd dreamed about but never seriously pursued. The program would require a significant time commitment and financial investment, but it would also open doors to specialized practice opportunities that could transform her career. As Maya had read through the application requirements and course descriptions, she'd felt a surge of excitement that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or expectations. This was something she wanted for herself, independent of family pressure or romantic relationships.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sunday had arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made the windows of Maya's apartment frost over in delicate patterns. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, settling on a charcoal gray dress that was elegant without being overly formal, paired with her grandmother's vintage pearl necklace. The jewelry had been a gift for her college graduation, one of the few times her grandmother had singled Maya out for special recognition. Derek had arrived precisely on time, looking impeccable in a navy suit and silk tie that suggested he'd put considerable thought into his appearance for the family dinner. His cologne was stronger than usual, and he'd clearly spent extra time styling his hair. When Maya had complimented his appearance, he'd seemed nervous and distracted, checking his phone repeatedly during the drive to Westchester. "Are you expecting an important call?" Maya had asked as Derek's phone buzzed for the third time in 10 minutes. "Just work stuff," he'd replied quickly, silencing the device without looking at the screen. "You know how clients can be, always wanting updates on weekends." The explanation had felt hollow. Derek's marketing firm was successful, but not the kind of high-pressure operation that typically required weekend emergency communications. Moreover, Maya had noticed that he'd been checking his phone compulsively for weeks, always angling the screen away from her view and responding to messages with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to work communications. The Chen family estate had looked particularly elegant in the winter twilight, with snow covering the expansive grounds and warm light glowing from the windows of the colonial mansion. Maya's grandmother had outdone herself with the decorations, filling the house with arrangements of white roses and evergreen branches that made every room feel like a winter wonderland. Maya and Derek had been greeted at the door by Maya's Aunt Carol, who'd been practically vibrating with excitement as she'd taken their coats and ushered them into the living room where the family was gathering for pre-dinner cocktails.
The atmosphere had been festive but charged with anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something momentous to happen. Maya's parents had been holding court near the fireplace, her father looking distinguished in a charcoal suit, while her mother wore an elegant burgundy dress that Maya had never seen before. They'd both lit up when Maya and Derek had entered the room, greeting Derek with particular warmth and enthusiasm. "Derek, wonderful to see you," Dr. James Chen had said, clasping Derek's hand in both of his own. "We're so glad you could join us for this special evening." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Derek had replied, though Maya had noticed that his smile looked forced and his voice carried an undertone of nervousness that matched her own anxiety about the evening ahead. Sophia had been notably absent from the pre-dinner gathering, a fact that Maya's grandmother had explained with visible irritation. "Your sister called to say she was running late, something about traffic from the city. You know how Sophia is with time management." Maya had felt a mixture of relief and disappointment at Sophia's absence. Part of her had been dreading another evening of watching Derek's attention shift toward her sister, but another part had been curious to observe their interaction now that she was actively looking for signs of their connection. The family had moved into the dining room at exactly 5:30, with Maya's grandmother directing everyone to their assigned seats with military precision. Maya had found herself placed between Derek and her cousin Sarah, directly across from two empty chairs that were presumably reserved for Sophia and a mystery guest whose identity hadn't been revealed. The meal had begun with Maya's grandmother's famous duck, accompanied by an array of traditional side dishes that represented hours of preparation. The conversation had flowed easily around topics of family news and current events, but Maya had sensed an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested everyone was waiting for something more significant than casual dinner conversation. Derek had seemed increasingly nervous as the meal progressed, barely touching his food and checking his watch repeatedly. When Maya had asked if he was feeling well, he'd claimed to have a slight headache, but insisted he was fine. His behavior had been so out of character that Maya had begun to wonder if he was planning to use the family dinner as an opportunity to break up with her, perhaps thinking that the public setting would prevent her from making a scene. The thought had been devastating, but not entirely surprising. Maya had sensed for weeks that Derek's feelings had shifted, and the family dinner would provide the perfect opportunity for a dramatic exit that would allow him to position himself as the victim of Maya's family dysfunction. She'd braced herself for the humiliation of being dumped in front of her extended family, trying to prepare responses that would allow her to maintain some dignity in the face of public rejection. Sophia had finally arrived as the family was finishing the main course, making her usual dramatic entrance with apologies and air kisses for everyone around the table. She had looked stunning in a flowing emerald green dress that complemented her dark hair and highlighted her delicate features, and Maya had watched Derek's entire demeanor transform the moment Sophia walked into the room. The nervousness that had characterized Derek's behavior all evening had shifted into something that looked almost like excitement mixed with anxiety. He'd straightened in his chair, and his eyes had followed Sophia's movement around the table as she'd greeted each family member. When Sophia had finally taken her seat directly across from Derek, the two of them had exchanged a look that was so charged with meaning that Maya had felt her stomach drop. "Sorry I'm late, everyone," Sophia had said, accepting a plate from Maya's grandmother with her most charming smile. "I got held up at the gallery, and then there was an accident on the highway that had traffic backed up for miles." "No worries at all, sweetheart," Maya's father had replied warmly. "We're just glad you're here for our big announcement." The words hung in the air with obvious significance, and Maya had noticed that both Derek and Sophia had tensed slightly at the mention of an announcement. Their reactions had seemed oddly synchronized, as if they were both dreading whatever news Maya's parents were about to share. Maya's mother had stood up as dessert was being served, tapping her wine glass with a spoon to get everyone's attention. The gesture had been unnecessarily formal for a family dinner, but it had effectively focused all eyes on her as she prepared to speak. "James and I wanted to gather everyone tonight because we have some wonderful news to share," Linda Chen had begun, her voice carrying the kind of excitement typically reserved for major life milestones. "As you all know, our practice has been growing steadily over the past few years, and we've been presented with an incredible opportunity." Maya had felt her anxiety spike as her mother had paused for dramatic effect, clearly savoring the attention of her captive audience. Whatever announcement was coming, it was obviously something her parents considered significant to warrant a formal family gathering. "We've been invited to join the pediatric cardiology team at Children's Hospital," her father had continued, taking over the narrative from his wife. It's a position we've dreamed about for years, and they've offered us the opportunity to head their new research division focused on innovative surgical techniques for complex congenital heart defects. The announcement had been met with a chorus of congratulations and excited questions from the extended family, but Maya had felt a cold shot of realization wash over her. Philadelphia was nearly 2 hours away from New York City, far enough to require relocation if her parents were going to take the position seriously.
That's incredible news, Maya had managed to say, though her voice had sounded hollow even to her own ears. When would you be making the move? Well, that's the exciting part, her mother had replied, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. They want us to start as soon as possible. We're planning to relocate by the end of March, which means we'll need to sell the house and find something suitable in the Philadelphia area. The implications had hit Maya like a physical blow. Her parents weren't just changing jobs, they were dismantling the family base that had anchored all of their traditions and gatherings for decades. The house where Maya had grown up, where every holiday and celebration had taken place, would be sold to strangers. The carefully maintained family dynamics that had defined her entire life were about to be completely disrupted. "What about grandmother?" Maya had asked, looking toward the elderly woman who had been quietly listening to the announcement with an unreadable expression. "That's another wonderful development," her mother had said quickly. "Sophia has offered to move back from Brooklyn to help take care of grandmother and maintain the family home. It's the perfect solution for everyone." Maya had turned to stare at Sophia in shock. Her sister had never expressed any interest in domestic responsibilities or family caregiving, preferring the freedom of her bohemian lifestyle to the obligations of traditional family roles. The idea that Sophia would voluntarily give up her artistic pursuits to become their grandmother's caretaker seemed completely out of character. "I've been thinking for a while that I needed a change of pace," Sophia had explained, her voice carrying a confidence that suggested she'd been planning this announcement for some time. "The art scene in Brooklyn has become so commercialized, and I've been wanting to focus more on my painting and less on the social aspects of being an artist. Living here with grandmother will give me the space and quiet I need to really develop my work." The explanation had sounded reasonable on the surface, but Maya had sensed something else beneath Sophia's words. There had been an undercurrent of excitement in her sister's voice that suggested the decision to move back home was motivated by more than just artistic considerations or family duty. "That's such a generous offer," Derek had said, speaking for the first time since the announcements had begun. "It shows real maturity and family commitment." The comment had struck Maya as oddly personal for someone who barely knew Sophia, and she'd noticed that Derek's voice had carried an undertone of admiration that seemed disproportionate to the situation. When Maya had glanced around the table, she'd caught several family members exchanging meaningful looks that suggested they knew something she didn't. "There's actually one more piece of news we wanted to share," Maya's father had said, his voice carrying the kind of barely contained excitement that suggested the biggest revelation was yet to come. "Derek, would you like to tell everyone about your new opportunity?" Maya had turned to stare at Derek in complete confusion. She had no idea what opportunity her father was referring to, and Derek's involvement in the family announcements had suddenly taken on an ominous significance that made her stomach clench with dread. Derek had stood up slowly, his face flushed with what looked like a combination of excitement and nervousness. When he'd spoken, his voice had been stronger and more confident than it had all evening, as if he was finally able to reveal something he'd been holding back. "I've been offered a position with Morrison Development Group," Derek had announced, his eyes scanning the faces around the table, but carefully avoiding Maya's shocked stare. Maya had felt the world tilt around her as the implications of Derek's announcement had become clear. Morrison Development Group was one of the most prestigious real estate development companies on the East Coast, exactly the kind of opportunity that ambitious marketing executives dreamed about. But the timing of the announcement, combined with Derek's obvious nervousness and the family's apparent prior knowledge of his news, had suggested something much more complicated than a simple career advancement. "That's wonderful news, Derek," Maya had said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing certainty that something terrible was about to be revealed. "Where will you be based?" The pause that had followed had been loaded with significance.
Derek had glanced around the table, his eyes finally settling on Sophia before returning to Maya with an expression that looked almost apologetic. "The position is based in Philadelphia," Derek had said quietly. "I'll be working closely with their team there to develop luxury residential properties in the mainline suburbs." The revelation had hit Maya like a physical blow. Derek wasn't just changing jobs, he was relocating to the same city where her parents would be moving. The coincidence was too perfect to be accidental, and the family's obvious excitement about Derek's news had suggested that his career move was somehow connected to their own plans. "What an amazing coincidence," Sophia had said, her voice bright with what sounded like genuine pleasure. "You'll practically be neighbors with Mom and Dad." The comment had been the final piece of a puzzle that Maya was only beginning to understand. Derek's career opportunity hadn't been a coincidence at all. Someone had orchestrated the entire situation, creating a scenario where Derek would be relocating to Philadelphia at exactly the same time as Maya's parents, while Sophia would be moving back to the family home in Westchester. Maya had felt a surge of clarity that was both devastating and liberating. The family dinner hadn't been organized to celebrate her parents' career advancement or Derek's new opportunity. It had been designed to announce a complete restructuring of family relationships that would effectively remove Maya from the center of her own life. "I think we should toast these exciting developments," Maya's grandmother had said, raising her wine glass with the kind of formal authority that always signaled the end of family discussions. "To new opportunities and new beginnings." The family had dutifully raised their glasses and echoed the toast, but Maya had felt completely disconnected from the celebration happening around her. She'd been watching her life being dismantled and reconstructed without her input or consent, and the realization had been both humiliating and infuriating. As the family had begun to disperse after dessert, moving into the living room for coffee and continued conversation about the various life changes that had been announced, Maya had excused herself to the bathroom to collect her thoughts and process what she'd learned. Standing in the elegant powder room where she'd hidden during countless family gatherings as a child, Maya had stared at her reflection in the antique mirror and tried to make sense of what had just happened.
Her parents were moving to Philadelphia, Derek was following them there for a convenient new job opportunity, and Sophia was positioning herself as the responsible daughter who would maintain the family home and care for their grandmother. The arrangement had been presented as a series of fortunate coincidences, but Maya had recognized it for what it really was, a carefully orchestrated plan that would allow Derek and Sophia to pursue their obvious attraction while maintaining the fiction of family duty and career advancement. Maya was being systematically removed from her own family structure, relegated to the role of distant relative who would visit occasionally from New York City. The cruelest part of the arrangement was how reasonable it all sounded on the surface. Maya's parents genuinely were advancing their careers with the Philadelphia opportunity. Derek's new position probably was a legitimate career advancement that would benefit his professional development. Sophia's offer to care for their grandmother was exactly the kind of mature family responsibility that everyone had been hoping she would eventually embrace. But the timing and coordination of all these developments had been too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had been working behind the scenes to create a scenario where Derek could transition from Maya's boyfriend to Sophia's partner without the messiness of a direct confrontation or obvious betrayal. Maya had splashed cold water on her face and taken several deep breaths, trying to calm the anger and humiliation that threatened to overwhelm her. She'd been outmaneuvered by people she'd trusted, manipulated into a position where any objection she raised would make her seem petty and selfish. The plan had been executed with the kind of precision that suggested months of careful coordination. When Maya had returned to the living room, she'd found Derek and Sophia deep in conversation by the fireplace, their heads bent together over what appeared to be real estate listings on Derek's phone. The sight had confirmed her worst suspicions about the nature of their relationship and the true purpose of the evening's announcements. "Looking at Philadelphia neighborhoods?" Maya had asked, approaching the pair with what she hoped looked like casual interest rather than the suspicious investigation it actually was.
Just getting a sense of the area, Derek had replied quickly, closing his phone and stepping slightly away from Sophia. It helps to understand the market when you're working in real estate development. The explanation had been plausible but unconvincing. Maya had noticed that Derek and Sophia had been looking at residential listings rather than commercial development properties, and their body language had suggested a level of intimacy that went beyond casual consultation about real estate markets. I spent some time in Philadelphia during college, Sophia had added, her voice carrying a confidence that suggested she knew more about Derek's plans than she was admitting. There are some really beautiful neighborhoods near the university that might be perfect for someone starting a new job there. The conversation had continued with increasingly transparent attempts to maintain the fiction that Derek and Sophia's interest in Philadelphia was purely professional and coincidental. Maya had played along with the charade, asking appropriate questions about real estate markets and job opportunities while internally cataloging the evidence of deception that was accumulating around her. The evening had concluded with the usual round of hugs and promises to stay in touch as various family members had departed for their respective homes. Maya had watched Derek say goodbye to Sophia with particular attention, noting the way their embrace had lasted slightly longer than social convention required, and the way Derek's hand had lingered on Sophia's back. The drive back to Maya's apartment had been conducted in heavy silence, with Derek apparently lost in thought, while Maya had struggled to process the magnitude of what she'd learned. The careful plan that had been revealed during dinner had explained so much about Derek's recent behavior and the family's odd dynamics over the past month. "So, when were you planning to tell me about Philadelphia?" Maya had finally asked as Derek had pulled into the parking garage of her apartment building. Derek had turned off the engine and sat in silence for several seconds before responding. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had carried a defensive tone that suggested he'd been prepared for this conversation. "I wanted to wait until everything was finalized before making any announcements," Derek had said carefully. "You know how these corporate opportunities can fall through at the last minute." The explanation had been another in a series of half-truths that had characterized Derek's behavior for weeks. Maya had sensed that he'd been prepared for her questions and had rehearsed responses that would minimize his deception while avoiding direct lies. "And you didn't think I might be interested in knowing that my boyfriend was considering a major career change that would involve relocating to another city?" Maya had kept her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. "Of course I was going to discuss it with you," Derek had replied quickly. "I just wanted to have all the information before we made any decisions about what it might mean for our relationship." The phrase "our relationship" hung in the air between them, loaded with the kind of irony that suggested Derek had already made his decisions without consulting Maya at all. The evening's revelations had made it clear that Derek's future plans didn't include her except as an inconvenient complication to be managed. Maya had realized in that moment that she had a choice to make. She could continue playing the role of the naive girlfriend who believed Derek's increasingly elaborate explanations, or she could acknowledge what she'd observed and take control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her influence. But as Maya had sat in the passenger seat of Derek's car, watching him struggle to maintain the fiction of their relationship while planning his future with her sister, she'd remembered something that changed everything. Something that had been developing quietly while she'd been distracted by the drama of Derek and Sophia's attraction, something that represented an entirely different kind of opportunity and connection. The secret that Maya had been keeping for the past 2 months was about to transform from a private comfort into a public revelation that would shift the balance of power in ways that no one else had anticipated. Because while Derek had been falling under Sophia's spell and the family had been orchestrating their elaborate relationship restructuring, Maya had been discovering something infinitely more valuable than anything she was losing. She'd been falling in love with someone who valued her, exactly as she was, someone who had seen her worth when everyone else had been distracted by more obvious attractions, someone who had been waiting patiently for Maya to recognize her own power and choose to claim it. And that someone was about to make an appearance that would turn the entire evening's careful planning completely upside down. The knock on the car window had come just as Derek was preparing to launch into another explanation about his career plans and their relationship. Maya had looked up to see a familiar figure standing in the parking garage, someone whose presence would transform the conversation entirely and reveal the truth that had been hidden beneath all the family's elaborate maneuvering. Maya, the voice had called through the glass, warm and confident, and filled with the kind of affection that Derek had never managed to convey. "I was hoping I'd catch you. We need to talk." Maya had rolled down the window and smiled up at the person who represented everything she'd been missing in her relationship with Derek, everything she'd been craving without even realizing it. The person whose unexpected arrival was about to reveal the most important secret of all, that Maya hadn't been the victim of the evening's revelations at all. She'd been the one holding all the power the entire time. Standing in the dimly lit parking garage, Maya felt her heart race as she recognized the figure approaching Derek's car. Alex Morrison walked with the same confident stride that had first caught her attention 3 months ago at the veterinary conference in Boston. His dark hair slightly tousled from the winter wind, and his green eyes bright with the kind of intensity that had made their first conversation last until the hotel bar closed.
Alex was Derek's younger brother by 2 years, though the family resemblance was subtle. Where Derek was polished and corporate in his appearance, Alex had the mugged handsomeness of someone who spent his time outdoors rather than in boardrooms. As a wildlife conservation specialist who traveled frequently for research projects, Alex carried himself with the kind of easy confidence that came from genuine expertise rather than carefully cultivated professional image. Derek's face had gone pale as he'd recognized his brother standing beside the car. The brothers had a complicated relationship that Maya had only recently begun to understand, filled with the kind of sibling rivalry that often developed when two people pursued vastly different definitions of success. Derek had followed their father's path into business and finance, building the kind of conventional career that impressed at dinner parties and family gatherings. Alex had chosen environmental science and conservation work, pursuing meaningful but less financially lucrative goals that their father had never quite learned to appreciate. "Alex," Derek had said through the open car window, his voice tight with what sounded like a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see Maya," Alex had replied simply, his attention focused entirely on her face rather than his brother's obvious discomfort. "We had plans tonight, remember?" The statement had hit Derek like a physical blow. Maya had watched the color drain completely from his face as the implications of Alex's words had registered. The careful plans that Derek and Sophia had been orchestrating for months were about to collapse under the weight of a truth that none of them had anticipated. Maya had stepped out of the car, ignoring Derek's protests, and walked directly into Alex's arms. The embrace had been warm and natural, filled with the kind of genuine affection that Maya realized she'd been missing throughout her entire relationship with Derek. When Alex had kissed her, soft and lingering, Maya had felt the last of her attachment to Derek dissolve completely. "How long?" Derek had demanded, climbing out of the car to confront his brother and Maya. "How long has this been going on?" "Since October," Maya had replied calmly, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "We met at the Wildlife Conservation Conference in Boston when I was there for the animal behavior seminar." The memory of that first meeting was still vivid in Maya's mind. She had been attending professional development sessions focused on advanced animal behavioral therapy techniques, hoping to expand her skills beyond basic veterinary care. Alex had been presenting research on rehabilitation techniques for injured wildlife, and Maya had been captivated by both his expertise and his obvious passion for his work. Their first conversation had started during the coffee break after Alex's presentation, when Maya had approached to ask questions about adapting his rehabilitation techniques for domestic animals recovering from trauma. What had begun as professional curiosity had quickly evolved into something deeper as they discovered shared values and complementary perspectives on animal care and conservation. Unlike Derek, who had shown polite but limited interest in Maya's work with animals, Alex had been genuinely fascinated by her experiences and insights. He'd listened with focused attention as she described challenging cases and innovative treatment approaches, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated both respect for her expertise and genuine curiosity about her field.
Their conversation had continued through the conference reception and into the hotel bar, where they'd talked until nearly 3 in the morning about everything from wildlife conservation strategies to their respective family dynamics. Maya had found herself sharing details about her complicated relationship with Sophia and her parents' expectations in a way that felt completely natural and safe. Alex had understood the dynamics immediately, drawing parallels to his own experiences with family pressure and sibling comparison. As the younger Morrison son, who had chosen passion over profit, Alex had spent years defending his career choices to relatives who measured success primarily in financial terms. His empathy for Maya's situation had been genuine and insightful, offering perspective that had helped her understand her own experiences more clearly. The conference had ended with an exchange of contact information and promises to stay in touch, but both Maya and Alex had sensed that something significant had begun during their long night of conversation. Their texting had started immediately, evolving quickly from professional networking to personal sharing to the kind of intimate daily communication that characterized deep emotional connection. Maya had found herself looking forward to Alex's messages with an anticipation that she'd never felt about Derek's communications. Where Derek's texts were often perfunctory updates about work or logistics, Alex's messages were thoughtful observations about his research, questions about her day, and sharing of experiences that created a sense of ongoing conversation even when they were thousands of miles apart. Alex's work required extensive travel for research projects, which had initially seemed like an obstacle to developing their relationship. Instead, it had created a natural framework for building emotional intimacy without the pressure of constant physical presence. Their connection had deepened through long phone calls during Alex's field research expeditions and video chats from remote locations where he was studying endangered species populations. The secrecy of their relationship had been Maya's choice initially, motivated by her uncertainty about how to handle the complications of dating her boyfriend's brother. She had wanted time to understand her feelings, evaluate the strength of their connection before introducing the inevitable family drama that would result from their relationship becoming public. Alex had respected Maya's need for discretion, though he'd made it clear that he was serious about their relationship and ready to handle whatever complications arose from his family connection to Derek. As their bond had strengthened over the past 3 months, Alex had become increasingly direct about his desire to move their relationship into the open, regardless of the potential consequences. The catalyst for revealing their secret had come 2 weeks earlier, when Alex had returned from a month-long research expedition in Costa Rica studying jaguar rehabilitation techniques. Maya had picked him up from the airport, and during their reunion dinner, Alex had made a proposal that had changed everything. "I've been offered a permanent position with the Bronx Zoo's Conservation Research Division," Alex had told her over dinner at a quiet restaurant in the village. It would mean no more extended travel, a stable base in New York, and the opportunity to develop long-term research programs focused on urban wildlife rehabilitation. The offer had represented everything Alex had been working toward in his career, the kind of opportunity that would allow him to pursue meaningful conservation work while maintaining a stable personal life. More importantly for Maya, it had meant that Alex would be permanently based in New York, eliminating the geographic challenges that had complicated their relationship. "There's just one condition," Alex had continued, reaching across the table to take Maya's hand. "I need to know that we have a real future together before I make this commitment. I'm tired of hiding what we have, and I want to build something lasting with you." The conversation had forced Maya to confront the reality of her feelings and the future she actually wanted. Her relationship with Derek had been deteriorating for months, based more on family expectations and social convenience than genuine compatibility. Her connection with Alex represented everything she'd been missing: intellectual stimulation, emotional support, shared values, and the kind of deep understanding that communication effortless. Maya had made her decision that night, agreeing to Alex's proposal that they reveal their relationship and begin building a life together openly. They had planned to announce their connection to both families gradually, starting with a private conversation with Derek that would allow him to process the news before it became public knowledge. The family dinner and Derek's obvious involvement in the elaborate Philadelphia relocation scheme had accelerated their timeline considerably. Maya had stepped out of the car, ignoring Derek's protests, and walked directly into Alex's arms. The embrace had been warm and natural, filled with the kind of genuine affection that Maya realized she'd been missing throughout her entire relationship with Derek. When Alex had kissed her, soft and lingering, Maya had felt the last of her attachment to Derek dissolve completely. "How long?" Derek had demanded, climbing out of the car to confront his brother and Maya. "How long has this been going on?" "Since October," Maya had replied calmly, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "We met at the Wildlife Conservation Conference in Boston when I was there for the animal behavior seminar." The memory of that first meeting was still vivid in Maya's mind. She had been attending professional development sessions focused on advanced animal behavioral therapy techniques, hoping to expand her skills beyond basic veterinary care. Alex had been presenting research on rehabilitation techniques for injured wildlife, and Maya had been captivated by both his expertise and his obvious passion for his work. Their first conversation had started during the coffee break after Alex's presentation, when Maya had approached to ask questions about adapting his rehabilitation techniques for domestic animals recovering from trauma. What had begun as professional curiosity had quickly evolved into something deeper as they discovered shared values and complementary perspectives on animal care and conservation. Unlike Derek, who had shown polite but limited interest in Maya's work with animals, Alex had been genuinely fascinated by her experiences and insights. He'd listened with focused attention as she described challenging cases and innovative treatment approaches, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated both respect for her expertise and genuine curiosity about her field. Their conversation had continued through the conference reception and into the hotel bar, where they talked until nearly 3 in the morning about everything from wildlife conservation strategies to their respective family dynamics. Maya had found herself sharing details about her complicated relationship with Sophia and her parents' expectations in a way that felt completely natural and safe. Alex had understood the dynamics immediately, drawing parallels to his own experiences with family pressure and sibling comparison. As the younger Morrison son, who had chosen passion over profit, Alex had spent years defending his career choices to relatives who measured success primarily in financial terms. His empathy for Maya's situation had been genuine and insightful, offering perspective that had helped her understand her own experiences more clearly. The conference had ended with an exchange of contact information.
Maya had texted Alex during the bathroom break at her grandmother's house, asking him to meet her at her apartment that evening because she had important news to share about Derek and Sophia's plans. Alex's arrival in the parking garage had been perfectly timed to interrupt Derek's latest round of explanations and evasions. The truth about Maya and Alex's relationship had provided the perfect counterpoint to the family's carefully orchestrated manipulations, revealing that Maya hadn't been the passive victim of their schemes at all. 3 months, Derek had repeated, his voice hollow with shock. "You've been dating my brother for 3 months while we've been together?" "While you've been planning your future with my sister," Maya had replied evenly. "Don't act like you have any moral authority here, Derek. I know about Philadelphia, and I know about Sophia." The accusation had hit its mark. Derek's face had flushed with guilt and anger as he'd realized that his careful plans had been discovered. The family dinner that was supposed to announce his transition from Maya's boyfriend to Sophia's partner had instead revealed that Maya had her own secret relationship that undermined everything he'd been working toward. "That's completely different," Derek had protested weakly. "Sophia and I haven't done anything inappropriate. We're just friends who discovered we have a lot in common." Alex had laughed at his brother's explanation, a sound that carried years of frustration with Derek's talent for self-deception and manipulation. "Right, just like your job offer in Philadelphia is just a coincidence, and Sophia's decision to move back home has nothing to do with your relocation plans." The brothers had faced each other across the parking garage with the kind of tension that suggested years of accumulated resentment and competition. Maya had realized that Derek's attraction to Sophia was probably motivated by more than just genuine feeling. It was also an opportunity to claim something that belonged to Maya, continuing a pattern of sibling rivalry that had defined their relationship since childhood. "This is unbelievable," Derek had said, his voice rising with anger and humiliation. "My own brother going behind my back to steal my girlfriend?" "Maya isn't property to be stolen," Alex had replied calmly. "But Maya was never really yours anyway, was she? You've been planning to leave her for months while pretending to care about your relationship."
The confrontation had attracted the attention of other residents in the apartment complex, and Maya had realized that they needed to move the conversation somewhere more private. She had invited both brothers up to her apartment, knowing that the discussion needed to happen, but wanting to control the environment where it took place. Maya's apartment had felt different with both Morrison brothers in the same space, the contrast between them becoming even more apparent in the intimate setting. Derek had moved through her living room like a stranger, examining her belongings with the kind of detached curiosity that suggested he'd never really paid attention to her personal space during their months of dating. Alex, by contrast, had moved with the familiarity of someone who belonged there, settling onto the couch where he'd spent countless hours during their video calls, and helping Maya prepare coffee with the easy teamwork that had developed during his previous visits to the apartment. "So this is why you've been so distracted lately," Derek had said, gesturing around the apartment as if seeing it clearly for the first time. "I thought you were just stressed about work, but you've been carrying on a secret relationship with my brother?" "I've been distracted because you've been emotionally unavailable for months," Maya had corrected, settling onto the couch beside Alex with a naturalness that emphasized the contrast with her stilted interactions with Derek. "You've been checking out of our relationship ever since you met Sophia at Christmas." The timeline had been important to establish. Maya and Alex's relationship had begun in October, but Derek's obvious attraction to Sophia had started during the Christmas gathering, which meant that both relationships had been developing simultaneously during the past month. "When were you planning to tell me about Alex?" Derek had demanded, clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered. "Tonight, actually," Maya had replied honestly. "Alex and I decided it was time to stop hiding our relationship, and I was planning to have a conversation with you after dinner about ending things between us." The revelation that Maya had been prepared to break up with Derek had clearly shocked him more than discovering her relationship with Alex. Derek's entire plan had been based on the assumption that Maya would be devastated by his departure and grateful for whatever continued connection their families could maintain. "But the family announcement, the dinner, everything we discussed," Derek had stammered, clearly struggling to adjust his understanding of the evening's events. "Was a performance," Maya had said simply. "I figured out weeks ago what you and Sophia were planning, and I decided to let you play out your scenario before revealing that I had my own plans." Alex had reached for Maya's hand, providing silent support as she'd confronted Derek with the truth about her awareness of his deception. The gesture had been simple but powerful, demonstrating the kind of intuitive emotional support that had been missing from Maya's relationship with Derek. "I don't understand," Derek had said, sinking into the chair across from the couch where Maya and Alex sat together. "If you knew about Sophia, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you try to fight for our relationship?" The question had revealed everything Maya needed to know about Derek's fundamental misunderstanding of their connection. He had assumed that Maya would compete for his attention, that she would view Sophia as a rival to be defeated, rather than recognizing that Derek himself was the problem. "Because I didn't want to fight for you," Maya had replied simply. "By the time I realized what was happening between you and Sophia, I had already found something real with Alex. Fighting for a relationship that was never genuine would have been pointless." The honesty of Maya's response had clearly stunned Derek, who had built his entire self-image around being the kind of man that women would compete to keep. The idea that Maya had voluntarily chosen someone else, that she had found him lacking, rather than simply being outmaneuvered by Sophia, had challenged his fundamental assumptions about his own desirability. "So all of this, the family dinner, meeting my parents, everything we've built together, it's just been a lie?" Derek's voice had carried a note of genuine hurt that almost made Maya feel sorry for him. "It hasn't been a lie," Maya had said carefully. "But it hasn't been as meaningful as either of us pretended it was. We were together because we looked good on paper, and because our families approved, not because we had any real compatibility or deep connection." Alex had listened to this exchange without interrupting, allowing Maya to handle the confrontation with Derek on her own terms. His quiet support had given Maya the confidence to be completely honest about her feelings and motivations without worrying about managing Derek's emotional reaction. "I can't believe this," Derek had said finally, standing up to pace around Maya's living room,
My own brother going behind my back while I'm trying to build a relationship with Maya? You mean while you were planning to leave Maya for her sister? Alex had corrected, his patience finally wearing thin. Let's not pretend you're the victim here, Derek. You've been manipulating everyone involved to get what you want without having to take responsibility for hurting anyone. The accusation had hit close to home. Derek's entire plan had been designed to minimize his culpability in the breakup with Maya while maximizing his opportunities with Sophia. By orchestrating the family relocations and career changes, Derek had created a scenario where he could claim that circumstances beyond his control had ended his relationship with Maya. That's not fair, Derek had protested. The Philadelphia job offer is legitimate, and your parents' career opportunity is real. I didn't manufacture those situations. But you certainly took advantage of them, Maya had observed, and you coordinated with Sophia to make sure everything aligned perfectly with your romantic plans. The evidence of coordination had been overwhelming once Maya had started paying attention. Derek's job interviews in Philadelphia had coincided perfectly with Sophia's visits to their parents' house. The timing of the various announcements had been choreographed to create maximum impact while minimizing opportunities for Maya to object or interfere. Sophia and I have been planning together because we care about each other, Derek had said defensively. We didn't want to hurt anyone, but we couldn't ignore our connection. And Maya and I have been building something real while you were playing games, Alex had replied firmly. The difference is that we're not trying to manipulate anyone else or avoid taking responsibility for our choices. The contrast between the two relationships had been stark. While Derek and Sophia had been engaging in elaborate deceptions and family manipulations, Maya and Alex had been developing genuine intimacy based on shared interests and mutual respect. The secrecy of Maya and Alex's relationship had been temporary and strategic, while Derek and Sophia's secrecy had been designed to avoid accountability. Derek's phone had buzzed repeatedly during the confrontation, and Maya had noticed him glancing at the screen with increasing anxiety. The messages were presumably from Sophia, wondering about the outcome of his conversation with Maya and expecting updates on the evening's revelations. You need to tell Sophia what's happened here tonight, Maya had said, noticing Derek's obvious distraction. She deserves to know that your transition from my boyfriend to her partner isn't going to be as smooth as you planned. The prospect of explaining the evening's developments to Sophia had clearly filled Derek with dread. His entire relationship with Sophia had been built on the foundation of his availability and Maya's presumed devastation at losing him. The revelation that Maya had her own romantic prospects would fundamentally alter the dynamic between Derek and Sophia. What am I supposed to tell her? Derek had asked, his voice carrying a note of panic. The truth, Alex had suggested simply, that Maya has her own life and her own choices, and that your plans didn't take that into account. The conversation had continued for another hour, with Derek gradually accepting the reality of the situation while struggling to adjust his plans accordingly. Maya had felt increasingly confident as the discussion had progressed, recognizing that her decision to reveal her relationship with Alex had shifted the balance of power completely in her favor. When Derek had finally left Maya's apartment, his departure had been subdued and thoughtful rather than angry or dramatic. The revelation that Maya had not been the passive victim of his and Sophia's schemes had clearly challenged his assumptions about the situation and forced him to reconsider his approach entirely. How do you feel? Alex had asked after Derek's departure, settling back onto the couch beside Maya with obvious relief that the confrontation was finally over. Free, Maya had replied immediately, surprised by how accurate the word felt. Like I can finally stop pretending that Derek and I had something worth preserving. The honesty of their conversation with Derek had clarified things for Maya in ways she hadn't expected. Articulating her feelings about Derek to his face helped her understand how much energy she'd been investing in maintaining a relationship that had never been as meaningful as she'd tried to convince herself it was. And how do you feel about us being public now? Alex had asked, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that Maya found endearing. Excited, Maya answered truthfully, leaning into his embrace with a sense of rightness that she'd never experienced with Derek. Ready to stop hiding what we have and start building something real together. They had spent the rest of the evening talking about Alex's job offer at the Bronx Zoo and what his permanent relocation to New York would mean for their relationship.
The conversation had been filled with the kind of practical planning and future-oriented thinking that had been completely absent from Maya's relationship with Derek. Alex's research position would involve developing rehabilitation programs for urban wildlife, work that aligned perfectly with Maya's interest in animal behavioral therapy. They had discussed opportunities for collaboration and the possibility of Maya pursuing additional certification that would allow her to work with wildlife as well as domestic animals. The Cornell program that Dr. Hoffman had mentioned suddenly seemed not just possible but essential to Maya's professional development. With Alex's encouragement and support, Maya had decided to apply for the advanced certification program that would expand her expertise and open new career opportunities. "I've been afraid to take risks professionally," Maya had admitted during their conversation. "I've been so focused on meeting other people's expectations that I stopped thinking about what I actually wanted to achieve." "That's going to change now," Alex had said, with the kind of confidence that came from genuine belief in Maya's potential.
You're too talented and too passionate about your work to limit yourself to other people's definitions of success. The support and encouragement that Alex offered had been in stark contrast to Derek's subtle discouragement of Maya's professional ambitions. While Derek had paid lip service to supporting Maya's career, he had consistently suggested that her goals were unrealistic or impractical, encouraging her to settle for stability rather than pursuing growth. The next morning had brought a series of phone calls and text messages from various family members who had heard about the previous evening's developments through Derek's reports to Sophia and Sophia's subsequent communications with their parents. Maya had found herself fielding questions and explanations about her relationship with Alex while trying to maintain boundaries about her personal life. Her mother's call had been the most challenging, filled with expressions of shock and disappointment that Maya had kept such important information secret from the family. Dr. Linda Chen had clearly been struggling to adjust her understanding of the family dynamics and her expectations for Maya's future. "I just don't understand why you didn't tell us about Alex," her mother had said during their conversation. "We could have included him in our planning if we had known he was important to you." The comment had revealed everything Maya needed to know about her family's approach to relationships and decision-making. Her mother had assumed that Maya would want Alex included in the family's elaborate schemes, rather than recognizing that Maya might prefer to make her own independent choices about her future. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to keep some parts of my life private while I figured out what I wanted," Maya had replied honestly, "and because I suspected that knowing about Alex wouldn't have changed your plans anyway." The family's reaction to Maya's relationship had been complex and revealing. While they had expressed surface-level happiness from Maya's newfound connection, there had been underlying disappointment that her relationship with Derek hadn't worked out according to their expectations. Maya's father had been particularly concerned about the professional implications of Maya dating Alex rather than Derek, pointing out that Derek's business connections and financial success had offered networking opportunities that Alex's conservation work couldn't match. "Alex is a nice young man, but Derek was building the kind of career that could have opened doors for you," Dr. James Chen had observed during his conversation with Maya. "Sometimes we have to think strategically about relationships rather than just following our emotions." The comment had crystallized everything Maya had been feeling about her family's approach to relationships and success. They viewed romantic partnerships as strategic alliances designed to advance social and professional goals rather than sources of personal fulfillment and emotional support. Maya's decision to choose Alex over Derek had been interpreted by her family as evidence of poor judgment and unrealistic priorities, rather than recognition of genuine compatibility and shared values. The contrast between her family's reaction and Alex's unwavering support had made Maya's choice feel even more validated. Sophia's response to the revelations had been the most interesting and complex. Unlike Derek, who had seemed genuinely shocked by Maya's relationship with Alex, Sophia had apparently suspected that something was developing between Maya and someone else, though she hadn't identified Alex specifically. "I knew you were different lately," Sophia had said during their phone conversation the day after the confrontation. "You seemed more confident and less worried about everyone else's opinions. I just assumed it was professional development or therapy." The observation had been surprisingly perceptive. Maya's relationship with Alex had indeed changed her perspective on herself and her relationships with others, giving her the confidence to set boundaries and make independent choices without constantly seeking approval. "Are you upset about Derek?" Maya had asked, genuinely curious about her sister's reaction to the disruption of their plans.
Honestly, a little relieved, Sophia had admitted with characteristic honesty. I was attracted to Derek, but I was also worried about the complications of dating your ex-boyfriend. This actually makes things cleaner for everyone. The conversation with Sophia had been more honest and direct than most of their adult interactions, suggesting that the crisis had created an opportunity for more authentic communication between the sisters. Maya had spent the following week fielding questions and managing family reactions while simultaneously making plans for her future with Alex. The contrast between the drama surrounding her relationship with Derek and the ease of building a life with Alex had been striking and clarifying. Alex's integration into Maya's life had been seamless and natural, from meeting her colleagues at the veterinary clinic to accompanying her to professional development events. Dr. Hoffman had been particularly impressed with Alex's expertise and had immediately begun discussing opportunities for collaboration between the clinic and the Bronx Zoo's conservation programs. "It's nice to see you with someone who understands your work," Dr. Hoffman had observed after meeting Alex. "Professional compatibility makes such a difference in long-term relationship success." The comment had highlighted another crucial difference between Maya's relationships with Derek and Alex. While Derek had viewed Maya's work as a pleasant hobby that provided conversation topics for dinner parties, Alex had recognized her expertise and potential for professional growth. 2 weeks after the family dinner confrontation, Maya had received news that would transform her career trajectory completely. Her application for the Cornell Animal Behavioral Therapy Certification Program had been accepted, with a partial scholarship that would cover most of the tuition costs. "I can't believe it," Maya had told Alex when she'd received the acceptance letter. "They want me to start in the fall semester, which means I could complete the certification while you're getting established at the Bronx Zoo." The timing had been perfect, allowing Maya to pursue her professional development while Alex was building his research programs. Their careers would complement each other professionally while providing mutual support for their individual growth. Maya's grandmother had been the most enthusiastic supporter of her relationship with Alex and her professional plans. During a private conversation at the family home, the elderly woman had revealed insights about the family dynamics that had surprised Maya with their clarity. "Your parents mean well, but they've never understood that success comes in many forms," Maya's grandmother had observed during their conversation. "They measure everything in terms of prestige and financial security, but they don't recognize the value of meaningful work and genuine partnership." The support from her grandmother had been particularly meaningful because it had come from someone who understood the family pressures Maya had been facing while also recognizing the importance of her independent choices. "Alex is good for you," her grandmother had continued.
He sees your strength and encourages your growth instead of trying to shape you into someone else's expectations. The observation had captured exactly what Maya had been feeling about her relationship with Alex. For the first time in her life, she was with someone who valued her authentic self rather than trying to modify her to fit predetermined expectations. 3 months after the family dinner confrontation, Maya had settled into a routine that felt both stable and exciting. Alex's position at the Bronx Zoo had begun with a successful research project focused on rehabilitating injured raptors, work that had immediately gained recognition from the conservation community. Maya had started her Cornell certification program with enthusiasm and confidence, finding that her previous experience with domestic animals provided excellent preparation for working with wildlife behavioral issues. The commute to Ithaca for weekend intensive sessions had been manageable, and Alex had often accompanied her to explore the area and provide moral support during challenging coursework. Their relationship had continued to deepen and strengthen, with the kind of steady growth that characterized partnerships built on genuine compatibility rather than external pressures. Maya had found herself more confident and decisive in all areas of her life, from professional challenges to family interactions. The family dynamics had stabilized into a new equilibrium that worked better for everyone involved. Maya's parents had completed their relocation to Philadelphia and were thriving in their new positions at Children's Hospital. Their research into innovative surgical techniques was gaining national recognition, validating their decision to accept the challenging opportunity. Derek had settled into his Philadelphia job with apparent success, though his relationship with Sophia had evolved differently than either of them had originally anticipated. Without the drama of competing for Derek's attention or managing Maya's presumed heartbreak, Derek and Sophia had discovered that their connection was more intellectual than romantic.
They had maintained a friendship that included occasional visits and professional networking, but the intense attraction that had driven their elaborate schemes had faded once the forbidden nature of their relationship had been removed. Both had eventually begun dating other people, with Derek finding a marketing executive who shared his professional ambitions, and Sophia connecting with an art curator who understood her creative process. Sophia had indeed moved back to the family home to help care for their grandmother, a decision that had proven beneficial for both women. Their grandmother had provided wisdom and perspective that had helped Sophia mature emotionally, while Sophia's presence had given their grandmother companionship and assistance with managing the large house. Maya had visited the family home regularly, often bringing Alex to join in Sunday dinners that had become more relaxed and authentic without the undercurrents of competition and hidden agendas that had previously characterized family gatherings. "It's funny how much easier everything became once everyone stopped pretending," Sophia had observed during one of these dinners. "We were all trying so hard to manage each other's feelings that we forgot to be honest about our own." The comment had captured the essence of what had changed in the family dynamics. The crisis that had forced everyone to reveal their true feelings and motivations had ultimately created space for more authentic relationships, based on genuine understanding rather than careful manipulation. Maya's relationship with her parents had improved significantly once they had accepted that her choices were motivated by personal fulfillment rather than rebellion against their expectations. Seeing Maya's success in her certification program and her obvious happiness with Alex helped them recognize that their daughter's path, while different from what they had envisioned, was leading to meaningful achievements. "We may have been wrong about what kind of partner would make you happy," Maya's father had admitted during a phone conversation 6 months after the family dinner confrontation. "Alex clearly brings out the best in you, and your professional growth has been remarkable since you started the Cornell program." The acknowledgement had meant more to Maya than elaborate apologies or dramatic declarations. Her father's recognition of her judgment and growth had validated her decision-making process and reinforced her confidence in choosing her own path. Maya and Alex had spent their first anniversary together visiting the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center where they had first met, returning to the Boston conference as established partners rather than strangers discovering unexpected connection. The symmetry had felt meaningful and hopeful, suggesting that their relationship had successfully navigated its first major challenges. "Do you ever regret how everything unfolded?" Alex had asked during their anniversary dinner at the same hotel restaurant where they had first talked until dawn. "Never," Maya had replied without hesitation. "The whole experience taught me that I'm stronger and more resourceful than I thought. I don't need other people to validate my choices or protect me from difficult situations." The confidence that Maya had gained through managing the crisis with Derek and Sophia had transformed every aspect of her life. She had learned to trust her instincts, set boundaries, and pursue her goals without constantly seeking approval from others. As Maya and Alex had planned their future together, discussing everything from career goals to travel dreams to the possibility of starting a family, Maya had reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than a year. The family dinner that was supposed to announce her relegation to supporting character in other people's stories had instead become the catalyst for claiming the leading role in her own life. The secret that Maya had been keeping for months had turned out to be the key to everything she had been missing. Her relationship with Alex had given her the confidence to recognize her own worth and the strength to choose authentic connection over convenient approval. Sometimes the most painful confrontations created space for the most meaningful transformations. Sometimes, when others tried to diminish your importance, the most powerful response was to expand into your full potential. And sometimes, the person you thought you were losing turned out to be someone you never really had, while the person you thought you were hiding was actually the one who had been waiting for you to choose yourself all along. Maya's story had become one of empowerment rather than victimization, growth rather than loss, and authentic love rather than convenient attachment. The family dinner that was supposed to end her happiness had instead become the beginning of a life that was genuinely her own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.